important question to ask is, with Trump's second impeachment, what did Republicans think about that? In terms of, many were very, very upset that he had basically instigated an insurrection. So let's get a sense of what some Republicans said about Trump and whether or not they supported his impeachment. Representative Lynn Cheney, these are all Republicans, said after when Trump was being impeached, the President of the United States summoned this mob, assembled the mob, and lit the flame of this attack. Everything that followed was his doing. None of this would have happened without the president. I will vote to impeach the president. Republican Representative Liz Cheney. To allow the President of the United States to incite this attack without consequence is a direct threat to the future of our democracy. For that reason, I cannot sit by without taking action. I will vote to impeach this president. Another Republican representative. The mob was inflamed by the language and misinformation of the President of the United States. Turning a blind eye to this brutal assault on our republic is not an option. I will vote yes on the articles of impeachment. So you should know for the test that only a relative small number of Republicans in the House of Representatives voted to impeach Trump. You don't need to know the exact number, but it was a small number, okay? So only 10 Republicans out of 100 plus Republicans voted to impeach him. So only these 10 thought that his actions were an impeachable offense. Why did the other ones not vote for impeachment? There might have been a variety of reasons. Some might have really supported what was happening, right? But we have Scott Bixby tweeting, Politico's political correspondent reported yesterday that many Republicans wanted to back impeachment, but fear casting that vote could get them or their families murdered. Because if they voted to impeach, then some people who are willing to use violence against Mike Pence and Nancy Pelosi would be willing to use violence against them. Now that's quite telling, right? In that we don't know how many people, Republicans in the House of Representatives, decided not to vote impeach Trump for his actions because they were worried that they or their family members might be murdered. But that's a very telling moment, right? We have a very important political writer for the New Yorker magazine, Jelani Cobb, responding to that by writing, the personal safety argument doesn't come close to justifying the 197 non-impeachment votes in the House. So almost 200 Republicans do not vote to impeach Donald Trump for his actions. A person too fearful to vote their conscience should resign immediately. You've just told the nation's enemies that a well-placed threat can compromise your vote. Well, what did most Republicans think about what had happened right after the assault on the Capitol? Surveys were done. The majority of Republicans supported Trump's recent behavior, meaning saying that the election was stolen, encouraging his followers to assault the Capitol, which is really incredible. You would think it would be not as many as that. The majority of Republicans said even after that, he should be the nominee for president in 2024. And very few Republicans thought that he should be removed from office. You should know that, right? That very few, a small percentage of Republicans thought he should be removed from office. Less than a fifth. Yeah, know that for the test. Less than a fifth of Republicans thought that what Trump had done meant that he should no longer be president. And that's what impeachment would have done, right? Would have accomplished if the Senate had voted to actually expel Trump from office after he'd been impeached by the House of Representatives. So, throughout much of Trump's presidency, there was a discussion taking place among academics, historians, looking at his actions as president and saying, is this fascist? So there was a debate. Is Trump a fascist, right? And after January 6, 2021, a lot of people were sort of on the fence. Historians were saying, yep, that's pretty fascist. So we have, for example, an historian of fascism, basically, who wrote after the insurrection, I've hesitated to call Donald Trump a fascist until now. And he wrote, Trump's incitement of the invasion of the Capitol on January 6, that should be 2021, I'm sorry, removes my objection to the fascist label. His open encouragement of violence to overturn an election crosses a line. The label now seems not just acceptable, but necessary. So here we have an historian of fascism saying that Trump, by his actions of encouraging the overturn of an election through violence, is fascism, right? So you should know that for the test. Yeah, that historians of fascism see that Trump, by encouraging violence to overturn an election, that constitute Trump as being fascist in his outlook. It's anti-democratic, obviously, right? You're trying to overthrow democracy. And that's one of the key characteristics of what it means to be fascist, to be anti-democratic, and to be violent in overturning democracy. Another important historian of fascism, Timothy Snyder, wrote, "The lie outlasts the liar." And this is very important, right? So the lie in this case is that the election was stolen, right? The election was stolen from Trump and the Republicans. The Democrats stole the election. That was repeated incessantly, and many people believe it. It was not stolen. But we have Snyder saying, the lie outlasts the liar. The idea that Germany lost World War I because of a Jewish stab in the back was 15 years old when Hitler came to power. Okay? So this, after Germany loses World War I, you have this lie coming about, oh, it's the fault of the Jews. The Jews caused Germany to lose the war, right? And that was a hideous lie, but it didn't mean anything until it meant everything. And that you see the rise of Hitler, and all of a sudden that lie that was 15 years old was used to begin the extermination of Jews across Europe. So Snyder writes, how will Trump's myth of victimhood, oh, the election was stolen from me, how will Trump's myth of victimhood function in American life 15 years from now? And to whose benefit? That's why things are really screwed. Yeah. In that Trump might die of a heart attack overnight, right? But the lie that's sort of been sort of born within the hearts and the minds of many Republicans that the election was stolen from him, that's not going to go away, even if Trump should disappear from the political scene. So the question is, what happens to it? And which future potential leaders of the Republican Party will make use of that lie at some point in the future to try to take over the Republican Party, to create a situation in which violence is used to take over the government? You might think this is far-fetched, but again, Germany was a democracy until the early 1930s, right? Hitler rose to power through democratic means. And then when he became chancellor, and when he was appointed chancellor through democratic means as were implemented in Germany at the time, then he used the power to take away democracy. It's not as if that can never happen in the United States. Democracies can fall. Democracies can be violently overthrown. There are many examples of that. So we have, after the failed insurrection in which Biden became president, you have a really interesting shift in that now it's reported that this far-right neo-fascist organization of the Proud Boys, they are very upset with Trump because he didn't follow through. They see him as weak, right? And it's not as if, again, if Trump goes away, these people are not going away. Their beliefs aren't going away, right? And their belief that it's completely okay to violently overthrow the government if they think they've been cheated out of an election, that's not necessarily going away. But at the same time, we have the Republican Party sort of bringing this lecture full circle in terms of the radical changes that the Republican Party has undergone over the last 100 years. Trump continues to be the de facto head of the Republican Party. So we have Lindsey Graham, who once called Trump a xenophobe and a bigot, and it would do nothing but lead to the destruction of the Republican Party. Now Lindsey Graham asks, can we move forward without President Trump? The answer is no. I've determined the Republican Party can't grow without him. So again, this is very reminiscent of people who might have been originally revolted by the previous Republican leaders who were considered fringe candidates like Barry Goldwater, but who then began to be accepted as part of the mainstream. Now, in a population lecture, I've shared a similar graph like this, showing the demographic future of the United States. So here we have a projection of what the United States will look at like in 2045, when white people, there'll still be the majority of the population, because there'll be more white people than others, but they're going to be a minority now in terms of they're not going to be over 50%. So you're going to have the majority of the population is going to be comprised of minorities. And that's really, really crucial for the end of this lecture. Again, let's look at the voters who voted for Trump. Yeah. So the 85% of the people who voted for Trump in 2020 are white. If in the United States you have a shrinking of the white population as the population of Latinos, Hispanics, Blacks, Asians, multiracial grows, then what does that bode for the future of the Republican Party? If we think about the fact that the GOP, the Republican Party, the grand old party, they've only won the popular vote for president once since 1992. That doesn't mean they've only won the election, because in 2000, George Bush, even though he lost the popular vote, the Supreme Court decided he got to be president of the United States. And then Trump loses the popular vote to Hillary Clinton. So it's only been one time since 1992 that the GOP has won the popular vote. So again, thinking about the changing demographics of the United States, what is the GOP going to do in order to have power at the presidential level? Well, there are a few options, and you should know this. What are the options for the Republican Party? The first option, the Republicans can do what the Republican Party said it should do in the autopsy report after Romney lost the election in 2016. They can get the votes of more people. They can appeal to voters who are not only white, or essentially they can embrace multiracial democracy, right? Try to get the votes of the Blacks. Try to get the votes of the Spanish Latinos. Try to get the votes of the Asians. Try to get the votes of the multiracial, right? So how do you get their votes? Have policies that they agree with, right? That's basics of politics and winning elections, right? So that's one approach, right? But that means that you're going to have to go beyond maybe the white nationalist wing of the party, and that might piss off that white nationalist wing, right? That's how the Democrats lost the white nationalists in the 1960s, because they started being more responsive to other people of other races. So while this is the no common sense, no-brainer approach that ought to be taken, this is not the approach that it appears will be taken. So that's one approach, though. The other approach is just seize power, right? I mean, this is what was attempted. And if it had been successful, if Trump had gotten Pence to throw the election into doubt, or has gotten violence to throw the election into doubt, he might have been able to declare martial law. And the president just basically sends the military into the streets and says, until things are settled, I'm going to be president. That's an extreme option. Now, he tried that. It didn't work, right? But that's one possibility, right? You could just seize power via violence. But then the party, a couple of things can happen if that happens, right? The party loses legitimacy in the field of electoral politics, right? So that's not going to help democracy out at all. But the other thing is, when violent coups take place, you start eating your own, right? So you would have even further right reactionaries within this already right wing reactionary party going taking over the means of power. So you might have a coup within a coup within a coup, right? And that's a very common process that takes place when violent democracies are overthrown in a violent manner. Finally, and this is what seems to be happening in terms of Republican Party options to hold on to power, they can wield power from a minority position, right? So they might not necessarily be, winning the popular vote at the, federal level, but maybe they can eke out wins, and they could do it via a few ways. One would be by voter suppression, basically making it really, really hard to vote, especially for people who might not be voting for you. And the other would be by something called gerrymandering. And that's every 10 years, state legislatures can redraw their congressional districts. And gerrymandering is just sort of drawing a congressional district that favors your party. Both parties do it, but we have most of the state legislatures being controlled by Republicans, and this is a map of a new congressional district map for Texas, drawn in such a way as to take a little bit of power away, to give a little bit more power or more numbers of representatives and electoral votes, which is just as important, to Republicans, in order to maybe give them even the elections are so close these days, right? So if you can even if you can win by one electoral vote, then that's what makes all the difference. So gerrymandering can help out with that process. So we have a political scientist at Harvard who wrote in a book about the Republican Party, if your base is 90% white and you're losing Asian Americans by 2-1, the black vote by 9-1, and the Hispanics by 2-1, voter suppression becomes the only viable strategic option. So you have to prevent people from being able to vote in order to be able to win. So I'm going to close this lecture with giving you examples of voter suppression and also attempts to enhance voter turnout. So in the year 2021, you had Republicans throughout the country introducing many, many bills that would have made it harder to vote. Now, this doesn't mean this passed in all of these states, right? But anyone can, let's say if you're a part of a minority in state government, you can still introduce a bill, but it's not necessarily going to be enacted. But let's say if you are from a Republican-controlled state and you're a Republican and you introduce a bill to limit voting, then it will be, and in many cases it is being enacted. Let me give you some examples of bills that have been introduced or enacted. One, closed voter registration on Sundays. Right, so only allow it to take place on certain days. Well, on Sundays, one of the ways that the African American community is politically organized is by church. Many African Americans are very religious. They go to church on Sundays, right? So after church, they would encourage people, hey, go register to vote, or even go do early voting. So if you close voter registration and early voting on Sundays, that can prevent groups of Black people from going to register to vote and to vote. Shorten the window to apply for a mail ballot. So only give people a very small amount of time to apply for a mail ballot. Restrict assistance in returning a voter's mail ballot. Basically, let's say if you are blind or if you're disabled, you have a hard time returning a mail ballot, and let's say someone can help you out, right? So, but if you can say, oh, that cannot be done, no one can help you do that, you must do it yourself, that would prevent certain people, let's say with disabilities, from being able to vote. Limit the number and location of mail ballot drop boxes. So if it's harder to find, if there are not as many, if it's harder to drop off a ballot, then that might make it harder to vote. Expand voter purges. That means, for example, a state might purge a voter roll. Let's say if you're registered to vote, but let's say you didn't vote in the last election or two. A state can say, well, this person hasn't voted, so we're going to say they're no longer registered to vote. So that's one attempt that has been carried out to expand people being voted from being registered to vote. Reducing the polling place availability. So if the locations of where you can vote or the hours of when you can vote are reduced, it'll just make it a little harder to vote. These are all things that Republicans have instituted in Republican-controlled states. Limit early voting days, right? So if there aren't as many days in which you can vote early, then that would make it harder to vote. Let me give you what was seen in 2021 as the most egregious example of a law passed trying that some people say is an attempt to prevent people from being able to vote. And so in 2021, in March, the governor of Georgia signed a bill into law that restricted a variety of voting rights. But the most egregious, according to some people, was that it was made illegal for someone to hand out water or food to someone who's waiting in line to vote. And the specific language of that is, nor shall any person participate in the giving of food and drink to an elector within 25 feet of any voter standing in line to vote at any polling place. Basically, if in Georgia, let's say if you're in Atlanta, right? So this is another thing, okay? So let's say if you're in a city in which Democrats, they're mostly Democrats, right? Because again, Republicans in the South are in the countryside and more rural areas. And let's say if you're in a rural area, you might drive to a local polling place. There might not be a lot of people who are there because there aren't a ton of people living in a rural area, whereas in the cities there are a lot of people. So let's say if you're in Atlanta, Georgia, you go to vote, and there are no longer as many polling places as there once were. And let's say it's hard to get there and you don't have a car, so you have to take a bus. You get there and there's a super long line. And you might be waiting 5-6 hours just to cast your ballot. That's a long time to wait. This law says that if you're in line, someone cannot come up to you and say, I'm sorry you're waiting in line so long. Here's some water. Or would you like a candy bar just to give you a little energy as you're waiting in these 5 hours in line? That is now against the law. Is there any reason besides voter suppression? Because let's say if you are in Atlanta, if you go to vote and you're in line for the longest time and you're thirsty or you're hungry and there's no food or water available and you're tired of standing and you say, forget this, I'm out of here. This is taking too long. I'm thirsty. I'm hungry. I'm going to go get something to eat. Forget voting. My vote doesn't matter anyways. I'm just one person. That's going to discourage you from voting. And if you can get enough people to do that, well, maybe that can make a difference in an election. On the other side of things, we see the Democrats in Congress, in both the House of Representatives and the Senate, attempting to pass legislation that makes it easier to vote. For example, year after year, some Democrats have introduced bills that would make voting a federal holiday. So the first Tuesday of every November, it's a federal holiday. You're not working. Most people aren't working, rather. That would make it so easy to vote. Republicans have been consistently against making it a federal holiday to vote. So we have the very first bill that was introduced to the House of Representatives for the new session in 2021 was called H.R. 1. That was the first bill, so H.R. 1. And it's called For the People Act. Here we have Nancy Pelosi and other Democrats supporting this bill. So let me just give you a sense of what and it's good to have a sense for the test just of what the Democrats are trying to achieve with this bill. Yeah? It seems commonsensical. One, it makes all states require online voter registration. Make it super easy to vote. So basically, the law would require states to say, you have to allow people in your state to register to vote online. Who wants to go to a post office and fill out a form, right? Make it easy. Then they say states also will have to have same day voter registration. Let's say you didn't register to vote and there's an election taking place. You can go to the polling site, you can register to vote, and then a minute later, you can cast your vote. Yeah. Obviously, you need to be eligible to register to vote. And so safeguards can be put into place to make sure that you are actually, a U.S. citizen who can vote. That's easily done. 3, guarantee individuals with disabilities the right to use absentee voting. Seems fair, civilized, right? If you have a disability, to be able to use absentee voting. Next, require states to allow at least 2 weeks of early voting for federal elections. Why only limit it to one day? If someone's working on that election day, give them plenty of time, at least 2 weeks beforehand, to be able to go vote when they have a day off. Makes total sense. Require states to allow any eligible voter to vote by mail in federal elections. Again, why not make it easy to vote? So this is what this bill is about. How do we make it as easy to vote as possible? So while this bill passed in the House, of course, in order for a bill to be sent to the president's desk to be signed, it needs to be passed by the Senate. This bill will not be passed anytime soon because as long as Republicans can so-called filibuster a bill, meaning that as long as there are 40 out of 100 people in the Senate who say, I don't want this bill to even be considered for a vote, so they can, quote unquote, filibuster it, then it's not going to be brought up for a vote, and it obviously can't be passed. So we have the Republican leadership in the Senate saying, no, we do not like this bill. And so you should know that the bill has been blocked by a Republican filibuster in the Senate. And that's where it stands right now. Passed by the House, blocked by the Republicans, and the minority leader, Mitch McConnell, has described the bill as an attempt to have the federal government take over how elections are conducted all over America. And I would say that doesn't sound like a bad thing necessarily, right? In terms of as long as it's about making it easier for people to vote. But, this is really what it comes down to. Now, Republicans will say that they need to have, tight voting laws to prevent voting irregularities, voting fraud from taking place. Very, very, very little voting fraud actually takes place, no matter how much Republicans might say it's widespread. It is simply not widespread, and that's been proven again and again. But it's the big concern, again, think about the demographics, right? If it's a federal holiday for people to vote, if it's super easy for people to vote, you know what that means? That means more people are going to vote. And who are the more people? It's the population as a whole, the voting age population who can vote. and they're not white. So the Republicans do not want these voting laws to be enacted because it's going to work against their favor unless they change their approach to how they get votes. So that's why the Republican leadership in the Senate is against this bill coming up for a vote. I'll close with this. A poll was done in late 2021 that showed that most Americans think elections are fair. But it says, but a sharp divide exists. So basically, most Americans think it's fair because most Democrats and independents think that elections are fair. But the report says many Republicans appear to have bought into Trump's lies about non-existent widespread fraud in an election he lost. So we have this graph here. And so Republicans and Democrats and independents were asked, if your candidate for president does not win in 2024, do you trust the results are accurate, that the results are accurate or not? 82% of Democrats said yes. Even if our candidate loses, I will trust that the results are accurate. Only 33% of Republicans said if our candidate loses, I will trust the results. Why do we have this widespread discrepancy between these parties in terms of them saying, if my candidate loses, I will trust the results? It's because of the lie that was promoted by Trump that the election was stolen from him. The majority of Republicans believe it. Therefore, no matter what happens, right? And let's say the election in 2024, if the Republican candidate loses, the Republican electorate as a whole will think that's because it was stolen from us. You cannot have a functioning democracy if the majority of the voters in one party think that it's an unfair election and that it's being stolen from them. So we have the person who carried out the poll. He wrote, Americans agreed that our democracy is threatened, but strongly split among party lines as to the causes. And this is the crucial thing I'll leave you guys with. When looking ahead to the 2024 presidential election, it is remarkable that a bedrock principle of democracy, that losing candidates and their supporters accept the results, is not held by nearly 2 in 3 Republicans who say they will question the results if their candidate does not win. That is an invitation then, this big lie and causing Republicans to doubt the veracity of elections is an invitation to political instability, to potential political violence, and is one of the most unfortunate events to have occurred in recent political memory.